Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department and co-director of the Political Economy Project. And on behalf of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Political Economy Project, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. It's a tremendous honor to have Professor Larry Summers here on campus today because he is, simply put, one of the most distinguished, interesting, insightful, experienced, wide-ranging, and provocative economists in the world. The range and depth of his knowledge across a wide array of issues is astounding to me, and the insight that he brings into just about everything he discusses, regardless of whether you agree or not, is remarkable and always thought-provoking. He really needs no introduction, but I'll just give you some of the highlights of his incredibly distinguished career. For the past 3 decades, he served in a number of senior policy positions in Washington, D.C., including as the 71st Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and Vice President of Development Economics and Chief Economist of the World Bank. He has served as President of Harvard University, and he is currently the Charles W. Eliot University Professor at Harvard, where he directs the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We have a limited time here today, so we're going to go right into it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Larry Summers. Well, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to be here. It's really an honor and a delight to have you. I'm going to have a wide-ranging discussion about a number of issues, and I thought I'd start out with sort of a turn in economic policy in recent years. That is, you've been a careful observer of American economic policy for a number of decades, and it seems to be that there's this bipartisan revulsion against past presidents in some sense. Going back to Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, they're being dismissed as neoliberals. So the progressive left has repudiated the Clinton and Obama administrations for deregulation, lack of antitrust enforcement, not pushing enough to have a more redistributive welfare state. And on the right, the national conservatives have repudiated the Reagan and Bush administrations to some extent for believing in free trade, for smaller government, for welcoming immigration. So how are we in this place where we have J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley sort of aligned with some issues with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, not on social policy, say, but against immigration, against big tech, against free markets, against immigration. How do you make sense of this development? Is this just sort of a lingering after effect of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009? Or were there big policy errors made in the past that we're now getting away from? How do you think about sort of the alignment that we see today?
So first, it's really good to be up here at Dartmouth. I first came here in the early 1970s when Dartmouth hosted an annual debate tournament, and I was a pillar of the MIT debate team, and I came and participated in that debate tournament each of the years that I was in college, and I've had the chance to visit your campus a number of times since, and my daughter, who just gave birth to my first granddaughter, is a primary care physician at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital, so I suspect I will be spending more time in the Green Valley in the years ahead. It's good to be here. It's good to be here, Doug. I'm an economist, not a historian, so I speculate on your question. Look, I think populism is catching on all over the world. The type of trend you describe is not unique to the United States. Look at the last French election, look at who's governing Italy, look at political trends in Germany, interpret what's going on with Modi, interpret the nature of political competition in Brazil or Mexico. So I think populism is the mood of the moment, and populism is something that goes back a very long time as a theory of economic policy. And I think it is sort of obvious what its appeal is. It is a fact that if you ask somebody who has not been trained in physics, whether if you drop a heavy ball or a light ball, which one will fall to the ground faster, people will confidently answer the heavy ball, even though that is not right. Similarly, if you ask people who have not been led to think hard about the question whether it's a good idea to keep out foreign products so that you can have more economy at home, they will say, yes, it is. If you ask them, is it a good idea to cause there to be lower prices by saying that businesses should not set higher prices, they will answer that question, yes. If you ask them whether it's a good idea to take money from the rich people and give it to most of the people, they will answer that question, yes. So there's a kind of visceral, simple appeal to populism, which is why it recurs from time to time. And it is likely to be particularly resonant at moments when people feel that expert elites are not doing a great job of looking out for them. And a combination of the financial crisis, perhaps rising inequality, for some people the fact that when you call a store, they ask whether you want to have your conversation in English or an alternative language, a whole variety of things that are happening that create uncertainty has led populism to have a renaissance. And then politicians want to win elections, and so hockey players go where the puck's going to be, and politicians go where the vote's going to be, and that is more towards populism. And that's why that is tending to happen in both political parties. I think most of this in the American context is unfortunate and will lead us to be poorer and will lead the rest of the world to be less secure than would otherwise be possible. Maybe one way of putting it is, I always thought that a really important thing was for Latin America and the United States to converge more. And I always took that to mean that Latin America would become increasingly democratic, that there would be a tendency over time for Latin American economies to become more open and resist protectionism, that Latin America would increasingly develop governing institutions that produced effective government for the people rather than just by the people. And I think the sad thing is that there is a kind of convergence going on, but the convergence is more, the United States is getting more like Argentina than it is that Argentina is getting more like the United States. And I think in many ways that's unfortunate.
Well, speaking of Argentina and speaking of convergence in policies, we have an enormous fiscal deficit, as you know, which is a little bit unusual because the economy is doing very well, close to full employment, and so that's a little bit of an anomaly. And I should note for the younger members of the audience that the last time the U.S. had a fiscal surplus was when you were Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. But both presidential candidates don't seem to be focusing on the deficit. The parties aren't so much, and yet the federal debt is over 100% of GDP. Interest payments exceed defense expenditures. Now, most countries can't go on. Argentina's sort of maybe not learned that lesson, but they hit that limit. But we don't seem to face a consequence. How worried are you about the fiscal deficit? Is a consequence coming? And what might that take? What form might that take?
So look, part of populist economics is some of the things I mentioned, and another part is if somebody will give you a credit card with a reasonably low interest rate, you'll borrow and spend for as long as they'll let you do that. And that's another part of populist economics, and that's what we're doing as a country. How long will people let us keep doing that? That's a very hard question to answer. You know, the US dollar is fortunate in its alternatives. Europe is a museum. Japan is a nursing home. China is a jail. And Bitcoin is an experiment. And so that is part of the answer to why we're able to borrow money for a very long time. How much longer will we be able to borrow money? I don't know. There would be a view that the debt to GDP ratio in the United States with today's sophisticated global capital market is about 100%, getting worse by 2 or 3% a year. The debt to GDP ratio of the United Kingdom in 1845 was 250%. So it may be that you can keep this going for a long time. But it also may be that you can't, and that people will wake up and say, why are we going to keep doing this? Or adjust or force some other adjustment. I'm pretty sure it's not the right thing for us as a country to be doing. After all, borrowing is not an alternative to tax increases or spending cuts in paying for what the government buys. It's a way of postponing those things, and because of interest, you end up paying more, not less, when you postpone paying. So I don't think what we're doing is prudent, and I think there is a real sense at a time when there is more of an axis in opposition to us and to what we stand for than at any time in the last 40 years. I think there's a real question of for how long can the world's greatest debtor remain secure as the world's greatest power? So I would like to see us be more focused on this problem. I think we are fundamentally, and this is a view that no one in the political process will state, I think we are fundamentally a undertaxed nation. I think we have gone, my political party, the Democrats, has gone from, over the last 65 years, John Kennedy saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We've gone from that to a middle-class Bill of Rights, which is all about what your country can do for you, and to vowing no tax increases on 99% of the population. I think what nobody says, and what the polity is not yet ready to accept, is this quite difficult truth. The fraction of the population that's over 65 is almost twice as great as it was when I started as an economist in 1979. Twice as great. And about half of what the government spends money on is taking care of old people. And so if it wants to take care of old people as well as it used to, it has to spend much more than it did. My friend, the venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, once said that we're headed towards a world, not there yet, but headed towards a world where you can buy a flat screen TV that will fill the whole wall of your living room for $100, and where a college tuition is going to be $1 million for 4 years. Not there yet, but headed in that direction. Think about what government buys. It's much more services. People to do research, what the FBI does, collecting the taxes, than it is physical things like flat screen TVs. That's another reason why the relative size of government has to increase. When I graduated from high school, just as the draft was ending, the United States spent about 6.5% of GDP on national defense. That 6.5% was down from the 10% that we had spent during the 1950s. Today, we spend 3.4%, and the projections that people use are that that's going to fall to 2.8% over the next 10 years. I am here to tell you that with what China is doing, what Russia is doing, what Iran is doing, what North Korea is doing, that we are not responsibly going to be cutting our commitment to national defense substantially over the next years. And inequality driven by market forces is widening, and part of what the government does is redistribute. So for those four reasons, redistribution, defense, services, an aging population, whatever your values are, you can be a progressive who thinks always that government should do more. You can be a conservative who thinks government should do much less. Whatever you think, you have to recognize that government's going to need to be significantly greater in the years ahead than we're used to. And that's going to mean that people are going to have to pay more in taxes. And until that idea starts to take hold a bit, I think we're not likely to deal successfully with the issues around the budget deficit. And there are a lot of crazy people on the left who say, doesn't matter, you can just print debt, print money, and it'll all be fine forever. And there are a lot of crazy people on the right and in business who say, if we just could take some costs out like I did in my business, then we could solve the deficit. Well, the deficit now is running at about 30% of, 25 to 30% of total government spending. And payroll is about 15% of government spending. So the idea that you can just sort of take people out and solve a large part of the deficit is just ignorant. And so I think we're going to need at some point to get thoughtful and serious about this. My guess is, given the fundamental strength of the American economy, that we have a while.
Talk about taxes for a moment. So if that's where we have to go at some point, there's wealth taxes, consumption taxes, higher income taxes. What's your preferred portfolio or mix? Obviously, depends on what the political process gives us, but is there...
Look, I'd start with enforcing the tax law we have. There's a tax gap, that is taxes that are owed but not paid. But not people who use tax shelters, just people who cheat, who don't pay what they owe. That is about $700 billion a year. If we invested, and we're starting to do this, if we invested another $10 billion a year, we could probably collect 100 of those 700 billion, maybe a little more. And that's surely the place to start in raising revenue. I think there's no question, and I think that the political figures who are more on the left side are right, that the place to start is with ability to pay. And the fact that I pay taxes at a lower rate than my assistant does, because a higher fraction of my income comes in various capital forms, I don't think that's appropriate. And I think that there are a variety of things we should do that adjust capital gains taxes, particularly important to adjust estate taxes, raise corporate taxes that would address that. But I think ultimately we're going to need to do some combination of broadening the tax base and raising income tax rates. I don't particularly see why. It used to be that the Social Security payroll tax ceiling covered 90% of the people. Now it only covers the top 83% of the people. I don't see why we couldn't raise that ceiling and in the process generate a significant amount of revenue. So I don't think there's any one silver bullet. I think there's a variety of things that we need to do if we're going to raise an adequate level of revenue.
You mentioned inequality. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But as you know, Professor Muirhead and Whelan and I co-teach a class called The Future of Capitalism, trying to go over, what is capitalism, what are its flaws, what are its merits, how do we contrast it to others. When you look at public opinion polls, Pew, there's a very interesting age gradient with respect to their views on socialism versus capitalism. Many young people are attracted to socialism, view capitalism as sort of this rotten, corrupt system that helps those who already have advantages. But older Americans are much more favorable towards capitalism, perhaps because they lived through the Cold War and saw the Eastern Bloc and what have you. What do you say to young people about the system we have, its flaws, its merits, and just sort of start that conversation?
So I had a chance to do something that when I was about the age of the students in this room, a little older, that none of you are going to have the chance to do. I had the chance to walk through Checkpoint Charlie from West Berlin to East Berlin. That would be kind of like walking through a gate from 2024 to 1954. Just everything just looked different. There's no comparison between the two. North Korea won't let anybody in because if you let people in, then you have to let them back out, and then other people can sneak out. So you can't walk from South Korea to North Korea, which is the other classic comparison for looking. There's plenty of room for debating whether capitalism the way we do it in the United States or capitalism the way they do it in Sweden is the better form of capitalism. But I have a lot of trouble understanding the moral impulses of the people who prefer socialism. And I would make 2 points that are not often made for your consideration. The first is, why is it freedom to say that any two consenting adults should be allowed to do whatever they want in a bedroom, but unthinkable to say that two consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want in a marketplace? If it comes to my hiring you for a wage you're willing to pay, my lending you money at an interest rate you're willing to pay, you're buying a product from me at a price you're willing to pay, to be against capitalism is to be against the idea that consenting adults should be able to do things they find mutually beneficial and not harming of a third party. And so the anti-capitalism position is at root a fundamentally anti-freedom position. And I have to say, Professor Muirhead, that I don't understand why so many political philosophers are not able to who think of themselves as great friends of freedom, are unable to recognize that truth. The second point about capitalism which is in some ways even more fundamental, was brought home to me by an experience I had about a year ago. I was invited to take a tour of Gillette Stadium, where the New England Patriots play, in which the Patriots owners were showing the owners of another team all the issues they had thought about as they built that stadium. Every word the Patriots owners said was about effectively sucking up to the people who bought tickets and went to those games. They called them guests. They talked about how it had been a great achievement to reduce the total time it took to clear the parking lot by 5 minutes. They talked in infinite detail about redesigning the queuing systems in the fast food places so people could get through faster. They talked about the design of the chairs so they were more comfortable for people's asses on cold days. It was all about sucking up. Now, that was not because these were like sweet, liberal, generous, charitable people. It was because the better they made the experience, the more people would be willing to pay for tickets to come. And that is fundamentally what capitalism incentivizes. It incentivizes sellers to suck up to buyers. And who are sellers? Sellers are people who are privileged. Sellers are people who are richer. Sellers are businesses. And they are hugely incentivized to figure out everything they can do to make buyers, who are they, everybody, happier. That is radically different from visit any socialist country. And people in a socialist country, they work really hard to get on the good side of their butcher because then they can get a better cut of meat for their family. They suck up to the people at the phone company because then they can get their phone installed in 2 months rather than in 6 months. And so fundamentally, capitalism is a system that is empowering of the mass that buys relative to the smaller elite that sells, and socialism is the opposite. And that's why when you talk about socialism, people say, well, it doesn't have the greedy, bad profit motive. Take a swim in the lake or rivers of any socialist country. Far worse than in a capitalist country, despite the fact that there isn't that unpleasant profit motive. Imagine that the Patriots were owned by the municipal authority football ownership team. I promise you Gillette Stadium would not be nearly as comfortable a place. So, should we have aggressive policies to maintain competition? Absolutely. Should we regulate banks so they don't have bank runs? Absolutely. Should we have taxation based on ability to pay and progressive and have it be more progressive than what we have now? Absolutely. But does it make any sense based on logic or the evidence of the experience of human societies to be for socialism or communism? I submit that it makes none. And I submit that, just because I'm trying to be provocative here, that the instruction one receives at the vast majority of America's universities, outside of economics departments, does not understand any of what I just said, and is to no small extent a bit morally insensate in not recognizing those aspects of freedom. You know, I used to think that there used to be this argument that gave me a little bit of pause, not much, but it gave me a little bit of pause that was made by my colleague Amartya Sen and all that, probably most prominently. And he would say, well, yeah, but you know, what's most fundamental about life and what's most fundamental is not economic growth and all that. it's human needs. It's keeping babies alive. It's having a longer life expectancy. It's having children become literate. And yes, Cuba may be desperately poor, but child mortality in Cuba is pretty low compared to a lot of the other poor places. And the same thing's true of a state in India called Kerala, and there's several other examples. Well, that's right. The fact is right, but it doesn't prove what he says it proves. What it actually proves is that if you have a basically functional place and you screw up all the incentives for markets to work, you may still have schools and hospitals that work. And so the schools and the hospitals do work in those places, okay, even though the markets and the incentives in the economy have been all screwed up. And so that's how you can get real poverty with decent kinds of human indicators. So gosh, Doug, I've probably gone on too long,
No, it's
but I
fascinating.
feel really
Right.
I feel really strongly about this, and you said you were a political economy program, so I thought that was maybe the most, if people learn only one thing about political economy, I think it should be their own version of the kind of thing I just said.
Well, we'll be talking about it in class tomorrow and in the weeks to come, so thank you for that answer. One of the big complaints about capitalism is inequality, which you've touched on. And there's various types of inequality: consumption, income, wage, wealth. And there's some debate among economists, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much about whether the top income share of the 1% has been rising, or whether it's sort of flat and splinter, or whether the tax transfer system has sort of worked to beat down and keep that from increasing over the past 2 generations or so. So what's your take on where we stand with regard to inequality? Is it still increasing? Has it been flat? Is it? Do we have to look at post-tax, post-transfer? What's your assessment?
I think it's probably better to look at these things post-tax, post-transfer. I don't think we measure these things very well. Think about this. It's kind of a remarkable thing. Think about this. I don't think you could spend $5,000 on a cell phone. You're Bill Gates. You don't care. Money's nothing. You just want the absolute infinitely best cell phone you can have. I don't think you could find one to spend $5,000 on. On the other hand, if you want to buy a $5,000 jacket or a $10,000 jacket, there are plenty of them. And our society is much more about stuff like cell phones. And everybody has one. Everybody flies. Everybody's able to go across the country now. If you think about it, which would you rather be? A 25th percentile earner in Hanover, New Hampshire, or John D. Rockefeller in terms of your standard of living? Well, if you like a flush toilet, the 20th percentile earner has it, and John D. Rockefeller didn't. If you like electric light, the 20th percentile earner has it, and John D. Rockefeller didn't. If you like being able to choose 1,000 kinds of entertainment to come on a screen in your house, the 20th percentile earner has it, and John D. Rockefeller didn't. If you like being able, once or twice in your life, to go all the way across the country, or all the way across the country in a day, you can do it, and John D. Rockefeller couldn't. If the worst thing that could happen to you is to have one of your children die before they reach adulthood, that's a 1 in 100 chance for you, and it was a 1 in 10 chance for John D. Rockefeller for each child. So when we think about inequality, let's think about all the things that even relatively low-income people have that nobody was able to have just a century, 120 years ago. Yes, we should do more to have taxation based on ability to pay. Yes, if I were in charge, I would, in a variety of ways, strengthen the social safety net. But I don't think the test of a society is its level of inequality. Ask yourself this question. Would America be better or worse off if it had 10 more people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Sergey Brin? I think we'd be better off as a country. There'd be more that people could buy. There'd be more interesting employment opportunities. We would be stronger. But what would the Gini coefficient say? The Gini coefficient, the Lorenz curve, they'd all say we have more inequality. So yes, are there things we should do to strengthen fairness? Absolutely. But is the right measure that we should just have less inequality for the sake of having less inequality? I think you have to think very hard about where that's coming from, what the source of the inequality is to get those kinds of things right.
Thinking about the future, I know you recently joined the board of directors of OpenAI, and you've thought deeply about artificial intelligence and its impact on the future. How transformative do you think it's going to be for the workplace and the future economy? And there's sort of AI optimists and AI pessimists. The optimists saying this is going to unleash incredible productivity. The pessimists say it's going to destroy jobs and we're all going to have to be on universal basic income. Where do you come down and how do you think about AI in the future?
I'll say these things. One, it's the general lesson of both financial crisis and technology that things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And my guess is that this is not going to transform the productivity statistics or the jobs in the next 5 years. But I think this is an immense thing if you think over a generation. Fire did not let you make more and better fires. Electricity did not let you make more and better electricity. But better artificial intelligence, like smarter people, helps create better still intelligence. And that recursive aspect, that leapfrogging aspect, is, I think, something that is very profound. And I think we sort of miss the point a little bit when we do these exercises about how many jobs will it be able to replace and so forth. The first video cameras or first film cameras, all that people could think of to do with them was to put them at the back of theaters and film plays and then put the plays on the film. And that really wasn't very interesting. And then people realized, you could make movies and you could edit it and you could splice the film and you could do all sorts of things, and then they had a profoundly different effect. So I think the mistake with any new technology is to just conceptualize it in terms of its ability to do the tasks that we have already identified and defined as tasks. And almost by definition, I don't know what the new ones are going to be, but I know this is a very fundamental technology, and I know that new opportunities will be created. If you had said to me even 15 years ago, I think it's about right, 15 years ago, that one of the highest market value opportunities from new businesses coming off the internet and wireless was going to be the complete disruption of the taxi and black car business, and that there will be companies worth tens of billions of dollars that were going to come from disrupting taxi cabs, I would have said you were crazy. And so it's just too hard to know exactly where fundamental things will come from. But I will tell you this. Here's the 75-second economic history of humanity. From the beginning of time till the Athens of Pericles, there was essentially no economic growth. From the time of Pericles till 1500, there was economic growth at a few hundredths of a percent a year, so a few percent a century. From the time of after the Renaissance and the plague till the early 1800s, there was economic growth at the previously unprecedented rate of perhaps 25 or 30 basis points a year, or 25 or 30% a century. Then there was the Industrial Revolution, and growth increased by another tenfold. Of all the GDP that humanity has ever produced, going back to the beginning of time, 70% of it was produced during my lifetime. And on modest projections, there'll be twice as much produced over the next 50 years as there has been up to this moment. I think it's possible that AI is going to mean another ratcheting up of normal growth rates that we expect, and that it's going to be an even larger event in economic history than the Industrial Revolution. And if that's true, it is going to change everything. And on the one hand, the Industrial Revolution is this extraordinary thing, and it's why we're all here in comfort. On the other hand, the years after the Industrial Revolution saw extraordinary political trauma and ferment that surely had something to do with the fact that there were 2 world wars, a Holocaust, and a Great Depression. And so to say that there is immense technology with immense opportunity is not to say that it will be managed well and stably. And so I think the magnitude of the issues that face your generation, I'm speaking to the students here, are actually substantially larger than the magnitude of the issues that faced my generation. Here's another way to say it. My grandmother was born in 1900 and she died in 1974. She saw outdoor to indoor plumbing, no candles to electricity, telephones, nothing to radio, to television, to color TV. She saw infectious disease not be something you worried about, child death become an aberration. She saw all of that change in her lifetime. If I think about what's changed in my lifetime, houses are nicer now. There's more air conditioning than there was then, though there was air conditioning in hot places when I was born. Yes, I do carry a phone in my pocket. Yes, there is an internet. Yes, I can type a paper in a much more efficient way than people could have 60 years ago. But if you compare that to what my grandmother saw, not nearly the same magnitude of change. But if you ask about my granddaughter, think about what artificial intelligence means. Think about what's happening with the capacity to manipulate genes and affect human health. Think about the fact that with solar and battery and fusion, we're going to see free energy within the next, nearly free energy, within the next 25 or 30 years. I think it's going to be a period of immense change, and the question is going to be how and in what ways we manage it and channel it.
We're getting a bit short on time, so We're going to go to the audience in just a moment. I want to ask, since you've been university president, obviously a close observer of what's going on campuses, hasn't been a lot of civility on campuses recently. The external view of universities has changed a lot. Sort of the prestige has sort of gone down, and people worry about whether universities are ideological projects or whether they can really be tolerant places for open discussion. Where are we with, let me put it this way. What advice do you give to university presidents in navigating this very difficult environment? How they should be thinking and rethinking the purpose and the direction that universities should be going?
I could talk for 2 hours on that and probably not persuade anybody. It's a really hard time to be a university president. Much harder. I found it hard, and it's much harder now than it was when I was a university president, because there are things you're supposed to stand for that are a bit incompatible. You're supposed to stand for free speech, but sometimes anti-Semitic speech or racist speech are free speech, and you're not supposed to tolerate them. So it's a very hard problem to know how universities should project. My view is that there's a fundamental covenant in the society, which is they let us be, in universities, an ivory tower with our academic freedom. They don't tell us how we should run our academic affairs. But the other side of that is we're not supposed to be political actors. And so universities are not supposed to have a position on American foreign policy or on who should win the election or even on trade policy. They should be places that have professors and scholars that debate all of those things, but I think universities should not have positions. And so when a university says that it stands for social justice or stands for a more generous welfare state, I think the university is overstepping its bounds. I think universities should be for their fundamental missions of teaching and research, and by my lights, they have in important ways lost their way a bit. They talk too much about social justice and too little about finding truth. They talk too much about celebrating community and too little about celebrating excellence. They put too much emphasis on identity and too little emphasis on universal values. And they have allowed themselves to be politicized by the set of people who choose to spend their lives in universities. Look, there's a basic fact, which is if you love capitalism, or even you like capitalism, there are really a lot of things you can do in the world. You can work for a company, there's a lot of things you can do in the world. If you really don't like capitalism, and you don't like profit, there are many fewer things you can do in the world. You can work for, if you don't like blood, so you can't do that. You can work for an NGO, you can write for a newspaper, you can work in a university. So it kind of stands to reason that the set of people who are going to end up in universities are going to be people who are a little with a perspective and an attitude towards capitalism on average. And it's just the way it is. It doesn't mean anybody's discriminating, but I think they should go further than I think universities need to do more to try to assure what I think is the most important kind of diversity, which is diversity of ideas that one is exposed to on university campuses. And I think most universities don't do so well. And they focus on the diversity of ideas that are represented on their current faculty, which tend to be from the center left to the further left. I was the Secretary of the Treasury. When I was in Washington, I always regarded myself as being on the right side of the left. So I was a Democrat, I was on the left, but I was in the more conservative part of the Democratic Party. In the Ivy League, that puts me comfortably in the right side of the right. And, I think that's a bit of a problem. And just in case there's anybody I haven't irritated yet with this answer, I'll just say, Doug, that I think that there is almost no university in the United States that has maintained a consistent standard on racism and anti-Semitism. And that if some group of students enunciated the views of the Ku Klux Klan, they might or might not be punished, but they would be surely, firmly, decisively denounced by those who lead universities. And they would be educated that their views were profoundly offensive to most and needed to be reconsidered. And I do not see, I think it is, somebody thinks that Israel has pursued the wrong policy in Gaza for the last 9 months. God knows he should be completely free to say that. If somebody thinks that Bibi Netanyahu is close to being a war criminal, people should be free to say that. But if somebody thinks that what happened on October 7th is a great victory and says that, as groups on this campus and on mine have, that is the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. And those who lead universities have the responsibility to call it out, and they have not met, in my view, that responsibility.
We're just about out of time, but I do want to see if there are a few student questions. My last question, however, which I think I told you about. One of the things I encourage students to do is go on YouTube and watch panels with you, because we've had this short time, but there's so many out there, and they're always enlightening, particularly the one at the Aspen Institute with Andrew Ross Sorkin was very good, a lot of high quality discussion. So you've done many of these panels, many of these Q&As. What's the most important question you haven't been asked? A lot of questions I didn't get to. China, the pandemic. And he had a prescient paper in 2016 on the pandemic, warning that we have to take precautionary measures. One of my questions was going to be, what's the next thing that we have to worry about? But more broadly, what are we missing as a society? What do you not get asked that you think is a little odd and that you should be asked about?
So a question that I always try to ask when I take on a leadership position or when I go into an area that I haven't thought about extensively before is I try to project myself forward and say, let's take one version of it, what will historians say was most important that happened at this point in time? And what got determined, what was settled, what was really important at this point in time that we might not be focusing on fully as we focus on the events of the day. And I find that the device of projecting yourself forward and then looking backwards is a very powerful one. Whenever I get involved with a new organization, I always insist that they do an exercise where I say, suppose 5 years from now, we are all commiserating on how we all had basically been a failure here. What do you think the most likely way that could have happened? And then I say, suppose 5 years from now, we're being celebrated because we accomplished beyond our wildest dreams. How do you think that might have happened? And projecting yourself forward and then looking backwards and trying to explain different possible outcomes is, for me, a very potent tool for trying to widen imagination. I think that when I apply that to kind of this moment, I already talked about one of what I think are the big things that this moment may have been remembered for, which is the emergence of artificial intelligence, and that being another ratchet in human society in the way that the Industrial Revolution was, or thousands of years ago, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was. I think a second issue that is starting to get a lot of attention, but may really be important, is what about the future of population? Almost everywhere, and I'm saying it this way, not to place responsibility, but because it's the way the statistics are created, almost everywhere, except in Africa, the average woman now has significantly fewer than 2 children. And that means that the next generation is smaller than this generation, and the generation after that is even smaller still. In Shanghai, the average woman has 0.6 children. That means each generation is a third of the size of the last generation once things stabilize. If a generation is 30 years, that means at the end of a century, you're at 1/27th of the population that you were at the beginning of the century. Now, Shanghai's extraordinary, but in lots of places, that fertility rate is closer to 1 than it is to 2. And even if it's falling by 1/3 every generation, 2/3 times 2/3 is 4/9. That says that within a 50, 60 year period, populations are falling in half. That's a very, very different world than we're accustomed to. Maybe it's a good world because the AI will do all the work, and we won't have a problem. We won't have a problem of excess workers, but a world where there are 3 times as many people in a society who die each year as are born, that is not something that any healthy society that was succeeding has ever had in the history of the universe. And that may be where we're headed. Nobody knows. Nobody's very good at predicting these things. There are governments in the countries that have this problem most acutely, like South Korea, who have tried to give tax credits when you have more kids and have paid child care and do things to give economic incentives. The evidence, as best one can tell so far, is that none of those things work very well at all. But that is evolving in this period. For native-born Americans, fertility is now at about 1.5. So you're basically having 3 children in the next generation for every 4 children, for every 4 people in this generation. and trending downwards. In China as a whole, there were only half as many babies born last year, and that was after COVID, as there were in 2016. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing. So I think that's a very kind of large issue that history will look back on. I think the other thing that history will look back on is that for much of human history, until maybe 1700, you would have said that the lion's share of economic activity, the lion's share of people were in Asia. And then, no. But it is all switching back, given what has happened in China, given what has happened. And so what all that means for the future and how we in the United States relate to China and to Asia, I think those are going to be very, very big questions. And I'll just say one last thing, if I could, Doug, and that's just to make a comment about individuals in this world. People ask me, students ask me, what advice do you have? And I would say this, the world's just increasingly complicated and increasingly specialized. And that means that whether you're a country or a company or a university or a person, strategy is more about building on strength than it is compensating for weakness. Because when there's more cooperation and there's more team, it's more about what you're best at, because whatever you're not best at, you're probably not going to be doing, somebody else is going to be doing. And so figuring out what your distinctive strength is and building on that is the advice I give people. And my one sentence is, don't be fungible. I see too many people, it seems to me, who kind of want to find something that a lot of other people are doing that's prestigious and well regarded and do that too. Well, that's fine. But I think you're more likely to be satisfied if you find a way of developing some expertise or some skill or some activity or some niche that makes you actually the answer to some question that somebody might have. And the people who find a way of doing that, I have found over time, tend ultimately to be more satisfied in their professional lives. And certainly there are plenty of problems to work on and plenty of opportunities to seize in the world you all are entered into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have time for just one or two questions from the audience?
Oh, sure.
Okay. We had a hand here, and let's see, a student right there. So let's collect two questions. We'll collect both questions, then we'll try to get a very quick answer on each, because we're just about out of time.
A lot of the populism that you were talking about, I think, stems from the financial crisis, and the narrative usually goes something like, policymakers are way too cozy with Wall Street, and that led them to recklessly pursue liberalization policies that benefits mainly business interests. And you are often seen as a poster boy of that rhetoric. You supported the partial repeal of Glass-Steagall when you were Treasury Secretary. You reportedly lobbied against executive pay caps in the stimulus bill when you were in the Obama White House. And at the same time, you've worked at different financial institutions like D. Shah. So what would your response be to that? And do you have any regrets on some of those decisions that you made, particularly in how it led to the populism we see today?
Do you want to collect another question or just go right to that?
No, go ahead.
Yep, over here.
Yeah,
Wait.
I guess. You spoke about U.S. and Latin American collaboration, like earlier in the talk. I was wondering if, like during the Clinton years, like generally how important was it that the Clinton administration decided to support NAFTA, like in Latin America, specifically like Mexico, as in like 1993, it appeared that Mexico was going to default on its debt and like its economy was going to shut down. And then like on another side question, I was wondering if you could speak briefly on, like, I don't know, some of your intellectual influences, like when you were a student.
Big set of questions.
I think just for time, I'll pass on my intellectual influences. Look, I think that it's hard to know what the counterfactual is, but I think there's a very good chance that if the United States had not adapted NAFTA, that we would be much less competitive globally, because there would be Japan and Asian countries working together with access to low-wage labor. There would be Western European countries working with access to low-wage labor in Eastern Europe, and we wouldn't have an ability to cooperate with a place that had low-wage labor. I think Mexico, which certainly has its fair share of challenges, would very, very likely be poorer and more hostile to the United States, and whatever problems we have around the border would, I think, be much more severe in that case. And I think that if we had not been responsive to Mexico, the whole idea of emerging markets, which have contributed to lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, would have been a less clear thing. So I am very proud of having been part of the Clinton administration's efforts to support NAFTA. And then, as you referred to, having been very involved when Mexico got itself into a terrible financial mess, being proud to have been involved in supporting Mexico through that mess. And in the end, US taxpayers made a profit. On your question, look, nobody probably can ever be completely objective about things in which they were engaged, and so you have to hear my answer, recognizing that. Would I like to have foreseen the financial crisis and to more explicitly warned about some of the particular things that happened? Yes. Do I think that the bill of particulars that you described is even close to accurate in describing why the financial crisis happened? I don't think so. And maybe I'll just spend a minute or two saying why. You highlighted something that I did support as Treasury Secretary, which was the partial repeal of the Glass-Steagall legislation. What that did was it in some ways facilitated the combination of banking and investment banking. Did that contribute importantly to the financial crisis? Yes, it is something that had the word deregulation associated with it. And people say, well, you were for something that had deregulation and there was a financial crisis, so your deregulation must have caused it. On the other hand, there was a lot of freedom before. So Citigroup bought Salomon Brothers, which was a counterpart of Goldman Sachs, before we had done anything to Glass-Steagall. If you look at the 10 years after the partial repeal of Glass-Steagall between 1998 and 2008, there wasn't a single combination that happened that wouldn't have been legal under the earlier law. If you looked at the country that was most stable coming through the financial crisis, Canada, it was a system that had universal banking and allowed its banks and investment banks to combine. If you looked at where the financial crisis was in the United States, it wasn't primarily in entities that had banking and investment banking combined. That was not Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. Those weren't banks combined with investment banks. It's not Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. Those had no banking operations. It was not AIG. That was an insurance company. It wasn't Wachovia or WAMU. So we didn't permit any new transactions. The places that were most stable had universal banking. The places where the crisis happened weren't combinations. And how was the crisis resolved? Well, JP Morgan bought Bear Stearns. That wouldn't have been possible without what we did. Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch. That wouldn't have been possible. The discount window was opened at the darkest moment to support Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. That would not have been possible. So I don't think the arguments about I don't think the arguments about Glass-Steagall being a contributor to the financial crisis are very convincing. Now you raise a different issue that's a very, very hard issue, which is, you said that I've been associated with working for D. Shaw and other financial institutions, and that's true. It was not true when I was in the Clinton administration, but it was true after I was in the Clinton administration and before I was involved in the 2008 financial crisis. And it's a very hard question how a society should manage this kind of thing. What was in fact the case was there were all kinds of ethics rules, so I couldn't conceivably have any continuing financial interest in anything that I'd had to do with or any understanding with respect to the future. But you could say, well, you're still sort of cognitively captured, and that's a valid thing to worry about. On the other hand, you probably want people regulating things who know something about them. And if you have people who have never had any experience with the things they're regulating, that's got problems as well. And so, the example I like to use in terms of posing the difficulty of the issue, and I use this example because it's outside of anything I've done or know about, is how should you think about nuclear engineering and nuclear reactors? You probably want the people who regulate nuclear reactors to know a lot about nuclear engineering and to have studied nuclear engineering. But really, why would you study nuclear engineering if you thought nuclear reactors are fundamentally unsafe? And so there always is a bit of a, what are you going to do when you study nuclear engineering? You're going to work for a nuclear reactor, or a nuclear electricity company, or you're going to teach nuclear engineering, or you're going to consult on nuclear engineering, whatever. You're going to kind of have a stake in nuclear engineering. So it's a very hard problem in a complex society how you have disinterested expertise. And I think the right answer is you sort of want to have expertise, and you want the expertise to be watched pretty closely. And certainly President Obama watched everything we did like a hawk and asked a large number of questions. And maybe I'll conclude by just telling a story because it sort of illustrates the complexity of being an analyst. And it also says something about leadership. probably 6 weeks into the administration, we had a meeting about our response to the financial crisis and so forth. And various of President Obama's political advisors were saying, there need to be any company that gets a pay cap has to have a salary cap that nobody can earn more than $1 million. And I was saying, we got to really be pretty careful because we've got a stake in these enterprises' success, and if they aren't well managed, it's going to be a lot more expensive for us. And President Obama said, Larry, you're really standing up for all those multimillionaires. And I said, no, but I think we have to be careful. And he made some other remark, and the political advisors were snickering. And we all left, and I was a little concerned and upset. And I so admired the fact that President Obama, probably 5 hours later, called me down to the Oval Office later in the afternoon, and he said, look, Larry, I'm getting crucified doing these bailouts. I get that these bailouts are necessary to stop us from having a depression, which will make things a lot worse for everybody on Main Street. I understand that, and I am doing the right thing, but I am getting crucified. And my ability to do what I do depends upon my having credibility with the broad public. Tell me more about what your concern is. And I said, look, the problem here is there's some guy, he didn't do anything wrong, he was responsible, he managed okay, and he has a contract that says he gets 8% of his trading profits, and he made $20 million trading, and 8% of 20 million is 1.6 million. And so he wants his 1.6 million because he had a contract that says that, and the institution's still going. And if he doesn't get it, he'll stop working for a bank and he'll go work for some hedge fund. And then who will manage the portfolio? I can see. He said, "Yeah, I can see that." And we went back and forth a little bit, and he said, "I don't want to do anything that you think is going to seriously damage the financial system, but I don't want to take more pain than I need to. And so why don't you guys sort of come back with what you think is a reasonable plan?" And we came back with a plan that gave a sense of constraining compensation in a variety of ways, but not in as simple-minded and draconian a way as had originally been suggested. And we said, probably we think on balance this is going to mess things up a little bit, but not hugely, and we understand the broad political equity, and that's what we did. And I just hugely admired the president's ability to understand that he was balancing a political equity that was really very important, and not to be embarrassed about the political equity and to insist that I internalized his political equity, but also to want to make sure we were doing a right and substantive thing. And I thought that was an example of government working very well. So I guess in sum, I would say medicine is never perfect, and hindsight is 20/20. And so in retrospect, there are things I would do differently if I'd had the benefit of perfect hindsight. But do I fundamentally regret the directions that I was involved in setting during the Clinton administration? No, they seem to me to have been reasonable and appropriate and rational in the circumstances and with the political constraints we faced.
We could continue this conversation for many hours. We're just delighted that you will be back in the Upper Valley, and there's a reason to be back, and we hope we can get you on the Dartmouth stage once again at some point in the future. But let's thank Professor Summers for taking the time to be here. Thank you all for coming. That was wonderful.
Sorry to come up and bug you. Larry Lessig gave an introduction. Was it good? If you'd be willing to allow us, Dave Walker, former top lawyer of the United States, to have a conversation with you about federal debt. We have
If he wants to get in touch, I'm happy to talk to him.
how would we
You can find me on the website at Harvard. Yeah? Yeah, just email it. Just send me an email.
thanks. So, thank you.
Thank you.